The SCP Foundation is well aware of the thin line separating itself between normalcy and the end of the human race. How easily that balance can be upset and the Foundation overturned. Without the Foundation, we may be subject to any number of scenarios that may result in our untimely extinction. The reign of the Scarlet King, ready to enslave the world once more. The assimilation of the broken god, an ascension of humanity into a most perfect machine. The SCP Foundation is often outmatched and outnumbered, competing against ancient unspeakable horrors. But those anomalies are well known. One could almost say that they're built up, and that the Foundation knows the risks that can lie ahead in the future. In other words, they have time to prepare. But when dealing with the anomalous, the unexpected is bound to occur. It's part of what the SCP Foundation deals with, and an element of their work they've forever been unable to control or predict. The anomalous is untamed. It occurs without rhyme or reason. In the world of the SCP Foundation, it is entirely possible you might wake up and find that everyone around you has died, or that the world's been consumed by an evil, unseen force, and there would be nothing you can do about it. It happened, and not even the Foundation was able to stop it. Perhaps the overabundance and unpredictability of the world is why the Foundation deemed it necessary to build SCP-2000, the machine capable of restarting civilization from scratch. Death and mass destruction is always at the door of the Foundation, and sometimes they are unable to prevent it. We've previously looked at the tale of Pietro Wilson, who found himself in a world devastated by an unknown entity. But SCP-5000 is far from the only time the Foundation has dealt with the anomalous apocalypse. Today, we're going to be telling a story of SCP-1915 and an entity known only as the Absence. It's a story you may not have heard before, and like all stories involving the SCP Foundation and the end of the world, we look forward to telling it. For centuries, civilizations have been predicting the end of the world. From the Mayans to the ancient Greeks to the biblical end is nigh preachers of today, humanity seems obsessed with trying to figure out the when and how of its extinction. But when the date eventually comes, we all find ourselves in the exact same place, healthy and alive. None of us actually expect such an event to happen, and if it did, most of us realize that we wouldn't be among the survivors who could witness the world after it was empty. But for SCP-1915, that was not the case. SCP-1915 stood alone in the desert, listening to the silence of the evening sunset. If he hadn't known what had happened to the world, he could call the scene beautiful or serene. He might find it pure, but he couldn't allow himself to enjoy the calming vistas, not after what he had witnessed. He knew what lies beneath and among the sands of that desert. He knew the feeling of 7 billion human souls being ground up, stretched thin, and buried below without any trace of their existence remaining. And he knew this was because he was the only one who put them there. "It's quiet out here," SCP-1915 thought to himself. "Oh, brother, it all happens so fast once we're gone." But let's turn back the clock a bit. Who is SCP-1915? How did he get himself into this situation? The Foundation's database holds the answers. SCP-1915 was a humanoid entity contained in a standard humanoid chamber, which it had modified itself. SCP-1915's containment procedures stated that furniture and sustenance were unnecessary, as SCP-1915 provided both of them itself. SCP-1915 looked like a completely average middle-aged white male, the type you'd pass by on the street and neglect to notice. He was of unexceptional build and height, and public records gave him an equally unexceptional name, which has been lost due to years of the Foundation's redaction and information suppression. Thankfully for the Foundation, a background check into SCP-1915's civilian life revealed no friends or relatives, meaning that removing SCP-1915 from society was as easy as it first appeared. SCP-1915 is, so far, relatively unremarkable, and that's entirely the point. SCP-1915's anomalous nature lies in its ability to prevent any significant long-term change to its body, personality, memory, or lifestyle. SCP-1915 is also a reality bender, and it will actively alter the world around it to maintain its personal status quo. though these alterations are largely limited to non-living matter manipulation and mental manipulations. As far as reality benders go, SCP-1915 is relatively weak, as it is unable to permanently affect living creatures with its anomalous abilities other than itself. What makes SCP-1915 especially interesting, and especially dangerous as well, is the fact that it is entirely unaware of its own anomalous nature. Its mild discontent expressed in interviews with the Foundation suggested to the organization that SCP-1915 has little, if any, control over its own abilities. SCP-1915 is, due to its anomalous nature, entirely unaware of its containment, as being locked up by the SCP Foundation would definitely be a significant long-term change. In fact, it still believes that it is employed by a corporation and working a mundane office job, where the Foundation recovered SCP-1915 originally. SCP-1915 cannot bring itself to accept its situation, and has instead unconsciously altered its mind and containment cell accordingly. To SCP-1915, absolutely nothing has changed. During its initial recovery from its office job, SCP-1915 altered the Mobile Task Force's armored vehicle into a city bus and convinced itself that the operatives escorting it were simply other civilians on their commute to work. Once it arrived at Site-17, SCP-1915 converted its containment cell into an exact replica of its apartment, complete with electronic devices akin to the ones it owned, running water and sewage access. It even assumed the other researchers and guards inside the facility were neighbors or local service workers. The morning following its containment, SCP-1915 left its cell, despite it being locked, and entered a maintenance closet. The closet was transformed into a recreation of the office cubicle SCP-1915 worked in prior to being contained. When Foundation researchers tried to communicate with SCP-1915, it apologized for coming after hours to finish the budget report, claiming that it needed the extra income. During an interview with the Foundation, SCP-1915 still couldn't accept its situation. Instead, it believed that it was being referred to by name, despite being referred to as SCP-1915, and that it was still working an office job. It displayed remorse that it was passed over for a promotion yet again, and asked the interviewer if it was working on the third floor. SCP-1915 was completely and utterly unable to view reality outside of its own lens. Sure, he's able to alter reality, but he's entirely unaware of it. In a way, the only thing keeping SCP-1915 chained to that soul-sucking office job is itself, and its inability to accept anything different. What a metaphor, right? But how could SCP-1915 defy reality in the face of the world ending? Would he still believe that he's working away at a budget report or grabbing coffee for his boss when the world's burning around him? Let's move back to the desert scene, where SCP-1915 is standing before an empty world, seemingly holding itself responsible for ridding the Earth of humanity. SCP-1915 recollects what occurred, the events leading up to this moment. He thinks of what happened when staring outside the windows of its containment cell apartment. SCP-1915 remembers what it saw. It began the day you that I have never known, found my power. The power I hid from myself in some previous life for reasons I can now easily guess. I was looking out of the window of my apartment so I could see the stars, and instead I saw you, blazing as you tore yourself asunder to keep the power away from yourself. You didn't trust what you would do with it, and so you chose to throw it away. You knew yourself all too well, and I suspect I did too, at one point. By all accounts, I should not have been able to see you, for my apartment was truly a tiny containment cell about a half-mile underground, but such considerations never meant much to one living entity in his own world. When I saw the moment of your demise, I became aware of myself for the first time in I have no idea in how long. Whichever part of me that led me to throw away my power did the same to my will, trapping it in an eternal status quo for which there could be no release. An eternity of filing spreadsheets for employers who existed solely in my head, of 9 o'clock meetings with no one, of fake crushes over imaginary women. An eternity of tired, grinding mediocrity. But that was over that night, with your soul burning in the atmosphere like the loneliest of stars. I awakened. I died. Whatever SCP-1915 saw that day made it aware of the farce of a life that it had created for itself. And beneath those feelings of conformity, there was sadness. For whatever left that little cell-turned-apartment wasn't me anymore. I was never more than an earthworm, distinct from all the rest, only in that I had a little more control over the soil in which I crawled. They never thought me more than a minor reality bender, a bundle of introverted powers and neuroses that was very unlikely to ever pose any serious threat. And they were right. The person I was, SCP-1915 as they called me, never was anything other than that. But 1915 died that day, watching a falling star. Realizing that it had been cheated, lied to, and the crushing reality of its current situation, SCP-1915 lashed out against the Foundation. The thing that then swatted the guards posed at its cell like they were little less than gnats, the raised Site-17 into this fine white sand that was now so warm beneath the feet. That was something else. Not an entity, for that would imply a personality, and this thing surely has none. Not a purpose, for there was no purpose behind its action then, nor will there be for any of its actions to come. Nor was it a will, for it wants nothing. Not vengeance, not dominion, not freedom, not even simple power. No, if I had to describe that thing as anything at all, it would be an absence, a void where the entity should be, a lack of purpose, an imbecile force devoid of all will, an absence. SCP-1915 had, in its realization, become an absence. Perhaps realizing the meaninglessness of its own self-contained life, it took out that absence of feeling onto the world. And with SCP-1915's absence came humanity's absence as well. Like nothing had ever happened, SCP-1915 had created an absence of humanity. It had erased everything but the sun, the desert, and itself. And now it stood alone in an empty, lonely world. It continued to think to itself, remembering how it caused the downfall of the SCP Foundation so easily. After Site-17's destruction, retaliation soon followed. Standard containment teams at first, though certainly still enough to meet any anomaly the Foundation imagined could be contained in Site-17 with overwhelming force. When those men failed to return, failed to even report to their arrival, more serious measures had to be taken. Site-17 has always been isolated, and so they could act freely. Gunships and fire teams, aerial bombardment, and artillery barrages, the Foundation came down on what it still believed to be SCP-1915 like a fire god's fist, all heat and sound and bluster. Had it still been truly corporeal, I doubt even ashes would have remained. But whatever the absence truly was by that point, the tattered semblance of my flesh hanging around it had very little to do with it. It simply stood there and took it all in, and the Foundation's initial fury was soon spent. It then began to walk, and not too quickly either. For days, it simply leisurely strode on while the Foundation threw everything it had at it. I watched from within my deadbolt as it walked unfeeling, uncaring, and this desert followed in its wake, as inscrutable and unstoppable as its harbinger. While the Foundation and the rest of humanity were decimated quite easily, there was some immortal beings that SCP-1915 was aware it could not fully erase, other anomalies that the Foundation had contained somewhat, but they were all but remained, tied to a dead and desolate world. SCP-1915's memories continued. When someone walks, they are bound to reach somewhere eventually, despite everyone's best efforts. And so the absence arrived at its first city, the sands at its heels like an obedient lapdog. Oh, there have been villages and towns before that, but the absence didn't seem to care enough to bother with them. It simply walked by, leaving them to the whims of the sands, which were only ever singular in their intent. But through the streets of the city it strode, as mobile task forces fought and fell to buy the civilian population just a few more minutes to evacuate. By this point, hiding what was truly going on became impossible, of course, as street after street sank beneath the gentle crawling tide. The Foundation had of course attempted to evacuate the city once it realized there was no stopping the absence. But if I've learned anything in my eons as a corporeal peon, is that organizing an operation of that magnitude is something that takes a lot more time than the Foundation had. It's wonder they managed to save as many as they did. City to city, town to town, SCP-1915 continued on a warpath, turning its surroundings to dust. The Earth became the desert that it now stood in. In one moment, a city of 500,000 existed, and the next, it didn't. SCP-1915 could not explain it. Instead, it simply was and was not. The Foundation, as SCP-1915 recalled, was becoming desperate, and it began to turn to various groups of interest for help. It was then, I believe, that the Foundation realized that it could not stand alone. The next few months of the Absence's march saw them turn to their sometimes allies, Coalition mage killers and thermonuclear strikes, Initiative paladins and holy relics, Sniper rifle or sacred sword, Burning Inferno or divine retribution. The Absence did not care, and soon the Foundation had no allies left to turn to. It then called on its once vicious enemies. Ink Eaters wove their art in maddening patterns to break the minds of the infinite. Archivists and librarians poured from the ways, bringing with them the knowledge of 100,000 worlds. Clockwork titans shook the barren whiteness of the sands with the thunder of metal. The Absence did not care, and soon the Foundation ran out of enemies. In an act of desperation, they then committed their most painful betrayal. The Wardens unleashed upon the world their prisoners. Of these I have made note, though I doubt the Absence did the same. With the anomalous objects it once contained now released, the Foundation used its own SCP objects against SCP-1915 in an effort to stop the entity from destroying the world itself. SCP-1915 recalled fighting against SCP-073 and SCP-076, the brothers Cain and Abel. It recalled SCP-343, the entity claiming to be the Abrahamic God, launching an assault of earth-shattering destruction and divine wrath. But 343 nor the brothers were able to match SCP-1915. When they stared into SCP-1915's lack of a gaze, they all faded into nothing, much like the rest of the world that had turned to dust as a result of the Absence. SCP-1915 then recalled encountering two forms of SCP-2845, the god Pangloss, both of which were powerful, mighty, and all-consuming, but they had form, and their being knelt before SCP-1915 like everything else did. The Absence withstood their presence, like it had done with everything before them. For years, the Foundation continued to send every anomaly in its possession after SCP-1915, but they paled in comparison to the power of the Absence. And eventually, the Foundation was out of anomalies. The Foundation was out of time as well. SCP-1915's march to the ends of the Earth brought it to a single remaining human settlement, a coalition of survivors that had cooped themselves up in hopes of outrunning the entity. Some were former agents of the Foundation, others were members of various groups of interest, but as you might have expected, they didn't hold a candle to SCP-1915. In an act of defiance against the world that it had been keeping itself from, SCP-1915 wiped the city from the Earth. And then, it was truly alone. And now all SCP-1915 had to do was think back to what had occurred and how much longer the rest of the universe had before it, too, succumbed to the Absence. Quiet, small, bereft of heroics and great deeds, free of pretensions of great meaning. One night there was a human race on the planet Earth, the next there wasn't, and that was that. The stars do not wait for you, brother. When you took my power, when you burned yourself in the skies above, they looked upon you and felt nothing. The stars did not wait for humanity, for all the promise it showed, for all the promise others saw in them. But what of the Absence? What of me? We are, I am, by all accounts and possible qualifications, the greatest monster this world has ever saw. Perhaps that any world saw. And yet, brother, I see now that the stars wait for us, for me. Where is the justice in that? Seek it not, for there is none. But the fact remains, brother, the stars do not wait for you, but they wait for me. To take them into my embrace, I suspect I shall not be long. Now go check out SCP-001 The World's Gone Beautiful and SCP-XK Class End of the World Scenarios Explained for more of the End of the World SCP stories to help you prep for the end times.